Guys, in today's tutorial we will be discussing about ExpressWebJs validation. Yes, to validate requests, any request coming into your ExpressWeb application, we need to validate that. So in the last tutorial we had where we discussed about creating a user management CRUD operation. This is more like a continuation from that. So in that series, we didn't handle validation. So in today's series, we'll handle validation to handle, every request coming into our system to make sure that they follow the exact object path that we specify in our app. Okay, so before I continue, if you've not really subscribed to this channel, please quickly click on the subscribe button for more updates on ExpressWebJs tutorials, and also check on the description for the GitHub link to this project. All right, so let's get started. What is ExpressWebJs validation? Going to the documentation page here under validation. So ExpressWebJs makes it easy to validate user inputs with the help of its validation feature. It looks at, let's look at a complete example of, well, all these things are just, normal English. So the thing here is that it validates user input using the validation feature. Okay, so to get started on that, back to our project. So this is the user management system we built, which is just a basic CRUD application of a user. So in the route section, API routes, you can see the different endpoints we have to fetch all user, to create a user, to get a particular user, to update a user by ID, and to delete a user. All right. So to create a validation for this endpoint, which is to save a user, going to the controller, or let's go to the DTO. So in the DTO, under user request section, these are the information that we are expecting: the user first name, the last name, the email, and the password. Okay, so let's quickly create a validation for this. Back to the website. To create a validation, we make use of this command. Okay, so to do that, I will say ts node maker make request. So the name of our validation will be user, or let me just say, user. User. So clicking enter will generate our validation rules in the app HTTP request folder. Okay, clicking on this. So this is our app folder, HTTP request folder. So inside our request folder, you can see user validation. So clicking on this, we have the empty user validation class. Okay, so in this section where we have the validation rule, all we need to do here is to pass in the different validation rules that we want for this particular endpoint. All right, so this endpoint accepts first name, okay, and is a required field. Also, it should be a string, and let the minimum character length be 2. Okay, next is last name, which is also a required field and also a string. And finally, the minimum character should be of length 2. The next is the user email. That's the email which is required, and it should be of type email. Okay, and finally we have the password. Okay, and the password is a required field, and it should have a minimum, it should accept a minimum character of, let's say, 5. Yeah. So with this, we have created a validation for our create user endpoint. Going back to our controller, in the store method, let me quickly bring this down. All right, so in the store method, as you can see, we are getting the request body, passing it to our user request DTO, and from there we are passing it directly into the service with no validation. Okay, so right now, to implement the validation we've created for this particular create user endpoint, we'll go back here, get the name, which is user validation, go back to our controller at the top, we import user validation from app http request user validation. Okay, so now we've imported our user validation. We come down to our method, which is the store method, create a constant or a variable called validate, and we say await our user validation dot validate. And what exactly are we validating? The request body. So in the next line, we need to handle the validation error if it fails. So if not validate dot success. So if the validation is not successful, we need to return http response dot bad request, passing in our response and the failed validation data. Okay, so with these 2 lines of code, we've handled our validation. Okay, so coming down to line 48, instead of passing in the request body, even though we can still pass it in because we've already done the validation, we can now pass in the validated data. So I'm removing this request dot user, sorry, request dot body, and I'm replacing it with validate dot data. So what we have in the validate dot data object is the validated data. Okay, so if I run my app npm run dev, if I run the server and go to my, okay, the server is loading. All right, so the server is running at port 5100. So if you want to know about the setup and configurations of ExpressWebJs, like I said, please watch my previous video on ExpressWebJs tutorial. Okay, so I'm using Thunder client to test my endpoints. So I'm creating a new request and I'm copying this. Okay, slash. Back to our routes, we said this endpoint is user/save. So over here, I'll put in user/save. Okay, and this is a post um, HTTP method, because over here, yeah, is a post. Okay, so in the body section, so without even putting in the request body, with our validation in place, if I send this request, I get this response, this error. Okay, payload errors, first name. Now the first name field is required, okay, because in our validation section we specify that the first name is required. Okay, last name is required, email is required, password is required. So that is why we are getting all this. First name field is required, the last name field is required, email field is required, the password field is required. All right, so now I'm passing in the request body. The first is our first name, and we say Alex. Okay, just passing in the first name. If I send this request again, you can see that now the first name has been validated. Is okay, it's perfect. The next is the last name, email, and password. So putting in the last name, you can say the last name is Ibokwe. Okay, with this, if I send again, you can see last name has been validated. It's now requesting for email and password. All right, so in the email section, let me put in let's say ibokwe.com. Let me put in, you know, an email that doesn't a string that doesn't follow the email pattern. Okay, so alex.ibokwe is not really a valid email. So if I do that, I get a different type of error. The email format is invalid because in our validation we said that the email should be of should follow the email format. Okay, so back to our request body. I'll now put in the right email, ibokwe at, let's say, gmail.com. All right, so if I now send this back, you can see the email is now accepted. It's now a valid email. Okay, now one last thing we need to put in here is the password. Okay, now in the password section from our validation rule, we said that the password is required. Fine. Also, it should be it should only accept a minimum character of 5. Okay, so back to my request body. If I pass in 1, 2, 3, 4 and send, it fails. It says the password must be at least 5 characters, at least minimum of 5. Okay, so if I go back to my request body and just make it 5, at which passes the minimum validation, minimum character of password, and if I send that, that works. Okay, so this is just a simple validation in ExpressWebJs. Back to the documentation, there are many ways you can handle validation. You can handle validation on complex data objects. Okay, so over here, all right, so one thing before I continue, if you notice in the user controller class, we imported our validation from the request user validation and now used it in the store method. Okay, so there's another way of handling validation, which we call the inline validation flow. Okay, so what we currently have here works. Okay, let's do it the other way around. So let me just comment this out. Over here, I create a constant called validate, which will now be equal to await request dot validate. Now our request object has a validation handler, which is validate. Now inside here, we pass in our request body. Okay, we pass in the request body and the rules, validation rules. Okay, so in these rules, we can, retype what we had in the other section. So here I put in the first name, okay, which is required. So instead of just typing this, let me go back to the validation and copy this. Okay, exactly. So now we have the rules here, and finally we repeat the same thing we have here. So if the validation if it's not successful, we'll return a bad request to the client. I save this. It restarts my server. All right, so my server is up and running now. If I go back to my request body and let's say I remove the password, okay, and I send this request. Oh, okay, I need to remove this. Yeah, it's better this way. All right, so if I send this, you can see the validation is still working. Okay, the password field is required. Okay, if I remove the last name and send, you can see last name and password field, both of them are required. Okay, so these are the two ways you can handle validations in ExpressWebJs. Okay, so for me, I prefer doing it the first way, handling it separately. The code is much more cleaner like this instead of having all this in my controller. So a different object handles the validation. All I just need to do is to import it here and implement it. All right, so that being said, let me quickly remove this. All right, so with this, we've added validation to these endpoints. Okay, there is still one more endpoint, which is the update endpoint. Yeah, to update a user record. So let's add a validation to that endpoint too. Okay, so updating a user record, what exactly are we expecting? Back to our DTO, we have user request. So I believe we're still expecting the same record. So I can even use the same validation for updating. So in my update method, which is this, come down here and paste this. So now I'm validating the user request body. Okay, so in the on line 97, instead of passing in the request body, I can now pass in the validate dot data. Okay, but one last thing, we are passing in the user ID as the request param. We still need to capture that in our validation. Okay, so to handle that, we will follow a little a different approach. So in on line 93, instead of validating only this, we also need to validate the request param, which is accepting the user ID. So I'll just copy this out and do wait, promise dot all. Here I'm passing in an array. In the first array, I'm validating. So let me just use inline validation here. Request dot validate. So in the request dot validate, I'm passing in the request param, request dot param. And what do we have there? We have the user ID. Okay, after that, we are passing in our validation rule, which is the user ID is required and is of type string, no, of type number. Okay, is of type string, because anything coming from this is a string. And remember, on line 96, we are converting it to a number. So is of type string. Yeah. So after this, we can, let me just make this readable for you guys. So I come over here, I handle the first one, and now in the second one, I handle the request body. So over here, we are handling the user ID coming from the request param. So we are calling request.validate. We are passing in the request param. We are passing in the request param, just the request param. And what we are looking out for is the user ID. Okay. After that, we now validate for the request body. So over here, I need to run multiple checks here. So I'll just copy this, come down here. So the first check is checking for, remember this is now an array, checking for the first array, which is for the user ID, and it sends the error data if the validation is not successful. Now the second one is now checking for the request body, which is 1. Remember, arrays start from 0 and 1. So this is the first one, which is 0, and this is the second one, which is 1. So I'm now accessing the second one, which is 1, and over here I still change it to 1. All right, so if this validation is successful, in my over here, instead of doing this, I will pass in the validate with the arrow, with the one I'm accessing, and dot data, and I'm accessing the user ID. Now in the second one, I'm accessing the first, that's the one here, and this is it. So with this flow, we are validating both the request param and the request body. Okay, so let me quickly run my server again. All right, our server is running. So back to the project. In the route section, the endpoint is user/update with slash the user ID. So going back to what we have here, so I'm changing this, and the method is a patch method. Okay, so I'm changing this to patch and this to, instead of save, update slash the user ID. So I think in my database I have a user, Alex, which is of ID 1. So that is the user I want to update. Okay, and without me passing any validation, if I send this, is returning this, just the normal thing we did the other time. And I just need to pass in the validation. So let's say I'm changing the first name to from Alex to Alex C. Okay, the last name, last underscore name. What do we have here? Prince. All right, I'm changing it to Ibokwe. Send with the email, and lastly the password. Okay, I'm changing the password to 12345 only. Okay, I need to fix this. Yeah. All right, so I send this. So duplicate entry. So this is coming from my database, which is another lesson I will handle. So the reason is this email already exists in our database, and all right, so I just need to use a different email. So let me say um, Alex. All right, so Alex works now. So if I head over to my database and refresh, oh, I already have a user before of okay, this is the ID. Yeah, I already have this user. Okay, the first endpoint we did to create this user, okay, it had an ID of ID3. So this is the one we updated. So let's change this name, first name, to something else. Let's change this to let me say Ken. Okay, and run again. You see it has been changed, updated to Ken, and back to my DB. If I reload this, that has been updated. All right, so this is just a simple validation in ExpressWebJs. Back to the documentation, like I said, this validation goes down in handling complex data objects. Okay, so over here, okay, yeah, the inline validation. Okay, we've discussed this. So working with nested rules. So let's say we have an object that has, the name, which is Alex, bio, which contains the age, education, which contains primary and secondary. Okay, so to write a validation for this object is very easy in ExpressWebJs. I mean, very, very easy. So you can come down here and so let's check the mapping. The first name is a string. Coming down to the validation, or rather, yeah, from what you have in over here, the first name is required, which is this. So this is being mapped to this. The second stage is age. Okay. Now in the validation, we are saying the age should only be a minimum of 18. So here we are passing 27, which works. Now coming down to primary, in our validation, we are saying that primary should be a string, which is what we have here. Same thing goes for secondary. Okay, so this makes validation very, very easy. You can also handle it in different ways. Okay, by using the flattened key pattern. Okay, so name is required. Bio, education, is inside. Age and education is inside bio. So this is the bio object. Inside of it, we have the age and we have the education. So to handle that, you can do bio.age, which is more like a way you the normal way you use in assessing data from an object. So bio.age, bio.education.primary, bio.education.secondary. You can also do a wildcard rule. There are a lot of ways you can handle validation in ExpressWebJS. You can also, use regular expression to handle validations. You can check the typings in your validation. So in this tutorial, we played around required. So we have required if any. So over here, we are saying that the name is required only if the age is 30. Now, in the age section, we are saying that the age is required and it should be of the range of 29 and 30. Okay, so for this second validation to work, age must be 30. So this name is only required if age is 30. Okay, you can decide to change the custom error message. So over here, we are saying that name is required. Now in the error message, you can have, you forgot to give a. Now this attribute sections specifies the name we have here. So this will be, you forgot to give a name. As you can see, if the validation fails, the error message will be, you forgot to give a name. Okay, so this attribute, this is replaced with the name of the attribute here, which is name. Okay, so it goes on and on. So this is more like a list of all the validations validation rules in ExpressWebJS. You have accepted, you have after date. So in the required section, let's quickly go down to the required. Yeah, we have required if, required unless, required with all, required without all. It goes on and on. So quickly, just spend some time on this documentation section and play around it. But guys, this is how validation works in ExpressWebJS. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching this tutorial. Also, please don't forget to subscribe on our channel. Click the subscribe button, like this video, and As time goes on, we will be releasing some videos as regarding ExpressWebJs. There are exciting things you can do with this framework. Okay, this framework is so good. There are exciting things you can do with ExpressWebJs framework. So thank you for watching and see you in the next video.